After pollination and the two sperm perform double fertilization, one fertilization again of the egg to make a zygote, and one fertilization of the polar nuclei to make an endosperm, you end up getting a seed. And the ovule is what develops into the seed, and you may have several ovules in an ovary, and the ovary is what will develop into the fruit. Frequently, that endosperm is going to be the primary source of nutrition. In some dicots, the primary source of nutrition ends up being the cotyledons. Again, if you're dicots, it'll be the two cotyledons. And here you can see that initial zygote is going to undergo a lot of mitosis, and it will ultimately form what will become an embryo, and then what will end up becoming sort of the shoot apex, the root apex, and then in between, you'll have what's called hypocotyl that we'll look at in a moment. And then the integument that's around the outside of the ovule thickens and becomes a seed coat, which protects the embryo on the inside of the seed. And then this is your endosperm, which again is formed by that 3N triploid result of the double fertilization, and that's usually going to provide nutrition. That seed coat isn't just protective, it also helps keep in water, and the seed enters a state of dormancy where there's very little metabolic activity. And seeds can stay that way for a long time, usually a year until the next season, but very often several years. Especially seeds that live in harsh environments. They often, in the desert for instance, will hang out until you get a particularly wet spring, and so it can be years before enough water is present in the environment to stimulate the seed to then germinate, and then you get a bunch of seeds growing and flowering at the same time. And here you can see in a garden bean, if you cut it open, you can see the epicotyl, which is going to be where the shoot comes off, the hypocotyl, which is sort of in the middle where the stem's going to be, and the radicle on the bottom is the young root tip that's going to grow into the root. And you have two large cotyledons. So in this case, your cotyledons are going to be there for nutrition. In a castor bean, you have much thinner cotyledons, but you still have an epicotyl at the top, a hypocotyl in the middle, and a radicle at the bottom, which will become the root and will grow downwards, whereas the epicotyl will grow upwards away from gravity, right? So negative gravitropism, usually positive phototropism toward light, and will become the shoot tip. If you look inside corn, you can see there's a single cotyledon in this case. So these are monocots, but still you have an epicotyl, a hypocotyl, and a radicle. It's beneficial for the plant if that seed is dormant through difficult seasons like winter or sometimes difficult years, but you also have to be able to then receive environmental cues to tell you, the seed, when it's time to germinate, and so usually those are temperature or light cues. When those environmental cues are present, so it's warm enough and the days are long enough, for instance, or you're close enough to the surface that you can see light for enough of the day, then germination happens. And typically, it's the radicle that's going to come out first, which is going to, again, become the root. And then you have the hypocotyl in the middle, and the cotyledons are going to emerge as the first seed leaves, the first photosynthetic structures, but they're not true leaves. The first true leaves come out next, and you can see it in the middle here. This is the epicotyl where the shoot is coming out. And it's pretty similar in a monocot. You get the radicle coming out first. The coleoptile is like a protective sheath around that shooting shoot, if you will. But you only have a single cotyledon to keep you sustained until the first foliage leaves come out. The ovary is going to develop into the fruit, and you can classify fruit in a number of ways. They all are reproductive structures that contain seeds, that develop from the ovary, but they might be dry at maturity, like those burrs that attach to your socks, or they may be kind of fleshy at maturity, and this is what we think of as a fruit, an apple, for instance. Fruits can also be classified as single, if you have just a single carpel, or multiple carpels that have been fused to become a single carpel. Aggregate, if you have a single flower that has multiple distinct separate carpels. or a multiple flower if you have several different flowers in a group of flowers called an inflorescence. Your pea fruit is an example of a simple fruit, right? So essentially a single carpel with lots of different ovules inside, which each become a seed. I know we don't think of peas as fruits, but they are botanically. In the case of a raspberry, we have a single flower that has multiple different carpels. And so you end up having this aggregate fruit. Now you have multiple different flowers all grouped together in an inflorescence, in the example of a pineapple, and each separate one develops from a separate carpel and a separate flower, and we call this a multiple fruit. Apples are actually an accessory fruit, which means that it's not just the ovary that develops into the fruit tissue. So the ovary develops into what we consider the core of the apple, but the rest of this fleshy stuff develops from other parts of the plant. Flowers are there to protect and help disperse the seeds, and a lot of fruits help disperse those seeds via wind. So dandelions are fruits. What we think of as the seeds are actually fruits. These feathery parts that have a seed at the bottom. Tumbleweeds are examples of fruits. Sometimes water is the method of dispersal. Think of the coconut that floats through the water, and that's why pretty much every place on the world that is warm enough for coconuts and has the appropriate water level has coconuts, at least the shorelines. And sometimes it's animals, and that's more typically what we think of when we think of fruit. Sometimes seeds are dispersed via the fur of mammals. So those burrs that get onto your socks also get onto animal fur. Or if you are a tree, like an oak tree, and squirrels hide your nuts and only find some of them the next season, the others remain planted and may grow into new trees. Ants sometimes can carry nutritious seeds and spread them around. And very often, the reason that fruits are full of delicious stuff is because they're meant for animals to eat them. And the seeds come out the back end along with a bunch of fertilizer, and wherever they happened to poo, all right, that new plant can grow, and so you're dispersed by animals in that way. We've focused largely on the sexual reproduction of plants because that's really what flowers are there for and what angiosperms are known for, but most plants, a lot of plants at least, can also reproduce asexually, which means they produce a genetically identical clone of themselves. Fragmentation is a mechanism of asexual reproduction by which a piece of a plant can then grow into a whole new plant with the same genetic makeup. My mother-in-law does this all the time. She'll sometimes take a cutting of a plant that she has and put it in a pot and grow it for us, or sometimes she will sneak up to the neighbors and she will snip a cutting of something that she likes, and I have a hard time getting her not to do that, but that is fragmentation. Sometimes root systems can spread and then shoot up new shoots from the spreading of the root system. So aspen trees are an example of this. A lot of people consider entire aspen groves to be a single organism. Sometimes you would consider them to be asexually reproduced, but they're all genetically identical. So those beautiful aspens that you'll see out in Colorado are either asexually reproduced from the same root system, or they are one giant mega-organism. Epimixis is a manner of asexual reproduction when a plant can form seeds from a diploid cell. So this is essentially like parthenogenesis in animals, where you have a diploid egg instead of a haploid egg. That's what happens here, and you end up with a diploid cell that becomes a seed. These various forms of asexual reproduction can also be called vegetative reproduction. And in a stable environment, asexual reproduction can be very advantageous. You don't have to find another individual to mate with. You can reproduce quickly, and if you were successful in your environment with your genes, presumably your offspring would be too. But if there are changes in the environment, you and your offspring can be subject to local extinctions. Sexual reproduction helps you hedge your bets. Your offspring will have much more genetic variation. It makes more evolutionary adaptation possible. But if you are rolling the dice, some of your seeds are going to be less fit, and so only some of the seedlings will survive. You also have to find a mate, although some flowers are able to self-fertilize in an emergency. So this means that you're not going to get quite as much genetic diversity, but you will be able to produce seeds if you don't find a mate, essentially. But for the same reason that most animals have taboos against incest, a lot of species of plants have evolved mechanisms to prevent selfing, right? They either can't do it or can't do it except in emergencies because it doesn't provide that necessary genetic diversity. One easy way to prevent self-fertilization is to have individuals that are different sexes. This is called being dioecious, meaning you don't have flowers that have male and female parts together. You have separate male individuals and separate female individuals that have their respective staminate or carpellate reproductive organs. Other plants have stamen and carpels that mature at different times so that they can't fertilize themselves because they don't have mature carpels when they're producing pollen, for instance. At the top here is a dioecious flower where you have male flowers or staminate flowers to the left with stamen and female or carpellate flowers to the right with just a carpel. Down here, the thrum flower has two different types, morphotypes, one with the stamen up high and one with the stamen down low, and the styles are reversed. And this means that essentially bees get the pollen on different parts of their body. And so, if this type of flower is more likely to not to fertilize, well, yeah, to fertilize, to pollinate and fertilize this type of flower and vice versa, and less likely to self-fertilize. The most common way to prevent selfing is just to have self-incompatibility with your own pollen. So there are molecular ways for your stigma to reject your own pollen, and you can't then have your pollen produce a pollen tube in your stigma. We humans have been taking advantage of plant asexual reproduction in agriculture for hundreds and hundreds of years. For instance, like my mother-in-law, people will take cuttings, and as long as inside that cutting is a callus or a mass of undifferentiated cells that can become any kind of plant tissue, as long as it has that, then it can grow into an entirely new genetically identical plant. Grafting is where you can take a twig or a bud and you can cut it off and graft it onto a closely related species or a closely related variety. And the stalk is providing the root system. That's what you're grafting it onto. The scion is what you're grafting onto the stalk. This is where all of our apples come from. Apples tend to grow as tart rather than sweet. And if they shuffle up their genes, they lose whatever sweet mutation they had generally, sweet combination of genes. And so if you have a sweet apple, you will take that as the scion and you will graft it onto any old apple tree stalk, and it will give you more sweet apples. So essentially every red delicious apple is cloned from an original scion, and it is grafted onto different stock. Now we can also introduce genes into a plant from an entirely different organism. These are called genetically modified organisms, and you can do this in a number of ways. For instance, protoplast fusion creates hybrid plants by taking protoplasts and fusing them together with the cell walls removed. Now, we've been genetically modifying plants for years in small, subtle ways by breeding them. So this is the ancestor of corn, and by breeding it with other individuals that had larger and larger kernels, we ended up with this over hundreds and hundreds of years. But obviously, genetically modifying organisms in the modern sense is an entirely different thing, in that you are taking genes in a single step from an entirely different species and placing it in the nucleus. And this is not without controversy. But there is hope that it can help reduce world hunger and world malnutrition by creating plants that tolerate herbicides, that create their own resistance to particular diseases and pests. And in that way, we can make more food to feed more people. And we can make food that might produce more nutrients than it would have otherwise to battle malnutrition. Or we can create plants and algae that may be better for producing biofuels so that we can reduce our dependence on fossil fuels and battle climate change.